Why did the cadets freeze the moment she stepped into the compound, as if they sensed something about her they couldn't explain? Sarah Reeves felt the shift before she even understood it. Eyes lingering too long. Half-whispered comments she wasn't meant to hear. A kind of nervous energy that always hovered around young soldiers who had not yet learned the weight of real war. She adjusted the strap of her duffel and breathed in the crisp Virginia air. After everything she had survived overseas, the dust storms, the ambushes, the moments where death hovered so close she could feel its breath, this place should have been simple. Instructor duty. A clean slate. A chance to use her scars for something meaningful. But something in the air tingled with tension. A reminder that peace was never simple for people like her. A cadet approached, stiff posture, rehearsed smile, the kind that wasn't real. "Ma'am, do you need assistance?" His tone felt more like challenge than concern. Sarah answered softly, "Just finding my building." She didn't owe him an explanation, yet she felt the familiar pressure tighten in her chest. The pressure women in uniform learn early. The unspoken question in people's eyes, "Are you sure you belong here?" Before she could take another step, 3 more cadets flanked him. They exchanged a look, subtle but sharp, a look she knew too well. And then she heard it, low, amused, careless. "Lost one." A phrase that could mean anything and everything. She kept her face blank, her expression unreadable, but inside a tiny ember sparked. Annoyance? No, something deeper, something older, something shaped by years of being underestimated before proving everyone wrong. They insisted on escorting her, forming a casual guide group around her, too close, too insistent, not threatening yet but wrong. Walking with them felt like being escorted to an unknown verdict. She let them lead. She watched. She memorized their steps, their spacing, the nervous smirks. Every instinct whispered the same warning: they think you're weak. They think you're alone. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was disappointed, because she had hoped today would be different. That maybe, finally, she could enter a place without a silent test waiting behind someone's eyes. When they opened the door to the barracks and motioned her inside, the air changed again. Laughter, whispered taunts, the scrape of a chair, a training knife flipping casually between fingers. She stepped into the room slowly, absorbing everything. 4 extra cadets, no instructors, no witnesses. This wasn't confusion, this was deliberate. They circled her gradually, not touching yet, but already crossing invisible lines. The room smelled of sweat, detergent, and the arrogance of boys who had never tasted real fear. Sarah placed her duffel down gently, not because she was scared, but because she didn't want them to think she was preparing for a fight. Even though her body knew the truth, if they pushed her, even a little, instinct would take over. One cadet made the mistake of whispering too loudly. "Grab her bag. Let's see what the lost BTCH brought." Her back tightened, her jaw set, but she didn't lift her eyes. Not yet. She forced a slow inhale. She wanted to speak, to warn them, to end the situation before it began. But she also sensed something deeper, something she recognized from her own early days. They weren't predators. They were children in uniforms pretending they understood the world they had chosen. Still, intention didn't erase danger. 2 cadets lunged to grab her arms. She sidestepped before her brain consciously made the decision. A fluid movement, muscle memory. One twisted in the air, the other crashed into him. Sarah hadn't even broken her gaze. Silence. Their mistake arrived too late, the moment they realized she wasn't what they assumed. "You want to try that again?" she asked softly, not mocking, disappointed. Jenkins stepped forward. His pride was louder than his common sense. That was luck. His voice carried a crack, fear, embarrassment, confusion blending into something reckless. "We weren't serious yet." He signaled the others. They spread out. A formation she hadn't seen since Afghanistan, poorly executed but still dangerous in tight quarters. She didn't reach for a weapon. She didn't need one. The first baton swing cut through the air. She caught the cadet's wrist and guided him into the table behind them. It shattered under his weight. Another rushed from the side. She dropped to a knee, swept him off balance, rolled, and reappeared behind the third attacker before he understood where she went. 3 down. Breathing quickened around the room, but not hers. Jenkins, red-faced and furious, reached into a locker and pulled out a training pistol loaded with rubber rounds. Close-range shots could cause serious injury. Maybe that was the point. Sarah exhaled once. Something in her hardened, a quiet, sorrowful line drawn in the sand. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice steady but low. He didn't listen. He never had. Before he could aim properly, she crossed the space in 3 decisive steps, disarmed him, twisted his wrist until he yelped in pain, and swept his legs. The world snapped into clarity as she pinned him to the floor, the training pistol reversed in her hand, barrel pressed to his collarbone. A breath. A heartbeat. Then she said the words that froze every cadet in the room. "Lieutenant Sarah Reeves, Navy SEAL, 3 Combat Tour, your new tactical instructor." The door burst open. The air shifted. Colonel Collins stood framed in harsh hallway light, sharp jaw, steady eyes, authority radiating off her like heat from desert asphalt. She took in the scene in a single glance. Overturned furniture, sweating cadets, a woman holding their leader on the floor with military precision. "I see you've met Lieutenant Reeves," she said, voice flat and lethal. "Not quite the introduction I intended." The cadets snapped to attention, terrified now, not of Sarah's hands but of Collins' silence. True authority seldom raises its voice. Collins looked at Sarah with something like grim amusement. "I assume they failed the character evaluation." Sarah released Jenkins and rose to her full height. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply stated the truth. Their judgment is dangerous, and judgment, Colonel, is what keeps people alive. The cadets flinched. The weight of their actions settled like ash around them. And yet beneath the humiliation, fear, and shame, Sarah saw something else in their eyes, something small, fragile, barely born. Recognition. Not of her strength, but of their own weakness. That was the first step, maybe the most painful one. As Collins dismissed them for disciplinary processing, Sarah stood alone in the quiet, wrecked room. Her heartbeat slowed. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind something heavier, a familiar ache she hated admitting. Why did every place feel like another battlefield she had to earn her way into? Why did proving herself still feel necessary after everything she'd survived? She closed her eyes for a moment. The moral whispered through her thoughts, soft, tired but true. Sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes it's the silence before the world finally learns who you are. Why did silence always feel heavier after conflict? Sarah Reeves stood alone in the dim barracks hallway, the echo of the confrontation still vibrating faintly in her bones. She hated that her pulse was still elevated. She hated that familiar burn in her chest, the mixture of adrenaline and disappointment that came whenever someone underestimated her. But what she hated most was how normal this felt, how expected. She had been here less than an hour and already witnessed the failure she feared the most. Soldiers who wore uniforms without understanding the weight behind them. She leaned against the wall, letting out a breath she'd been holding since the moment Jenkins lifted that training pistol. The truth pressed hard against her ribs. She didn't want to punish them. That wasn't why she came. She came because teaching meant saving lives before the battlefield had a chance to take them. Footsteps approached. Colonel Collins. Her presence filled the hallway like a storm front, calm, controlled, but carrying the pressure of unspoken expectations. "Lieutenant," she said, voice steady, "walk with me." They moved through the corridor quietly. The hum of distant generators, the occasional clatter from the yard, muted voices from cadets trying to pretend they weren't shaken. It all felt like a base bracing for something bigger. "You handled that with restraint," Collins said finally. "Not a compliment, an observation." Restraint was the only thing that kept them from getting seriously hurt, Sarah replied. They didn't understand the situation they created. And now they do. Sarah stopped walking. Do they, she asked softly, or do they only understand the fear of being caught? Colin studied her, eyes sharp, calculating, but with a flicker of something human beneath the command. What do you recommend? She asked. Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her instinct screamed for consequences. Her experience whispered for compassion. And somewhere in between, her heart, tired from too many deployments and too many assumptions, wanted something the military rarely gave. Change that meant something. She finally said, I want to train them, all of them. Collins raised an eyebrow. You want to keep them? I want to rebuild them, Sarah corrected. Because dismissing them teaches nothing, but transforming them that could save futures, maybe even lives. Collins was silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that made Sarah wonder if she'd overstepped. Then the colonel nodded slowly. Very well, 3 days, push them, break them down, see what remains. Sarah exhaled quietly. It wasn't relief, it was resolve. The next 72 hours felt like war without bullets. The cadets woke before dawn, ran until their legs trembled, drilled until their hands blistered, ate standing up, studied until their eyelids flickered with exhaustion. And everywhere they turned, Sarah was there, not yelling, not humiliating, not towering above them. Leading them. Outrunning them. Outshooting them. Outthinking them. Not to show superiority, but to show possibility. Some cadets broke down quietly in the dark hours before morning. She found one sitting behind the mess hall, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. She didn't scold him. She simply sat down beside him until he calmed enough to breathe. Another froze during a navigation drill, paralyzed by the fear of failing again. She didn't bark an order. She guided him through it step by step. They weren't bad. They were unshaped, untested, unprepared for a world where mistakes had real consequences. And for the first time since arriving, Sarah felt something unexpected, a faint thread of hope weaving through the exhaustion. But something else lurked beneath that hope, something she hadn't confronted in years, a question she didn't want to answer. Why was she working so hard to save soldiers who had disrespected her? Midway through the second night, while the cadets slept in a barely conscious heap, Collins found Sarah standing alone on the quiet firing range, staring at the stars as if searching for meaning in them. You don't sleep, Collins said. Never been good at it, Sarah whispered. Too much on your mind. Too much in her past, she thought, but she didn't say it. The ghosts of her last deployment flickered through her memory, a teammate she couldn't save, a call she made that still tasted like regret, the report she signed that ended someone's career, the burden she carried silently. You're pushing them hard, Collins continued. They need it. And you, Collins asked. Sarah didn't answer. She didn't know how. Dawn on the third day felt different. The air was colder, the sky sharper. The cadets stood straighter, even with their bodies aching. When Sarah walked toward them, they didn't look away like before. They looked at her like someone they wanted to be worthy of. She scanned the formation, eyes sharp, assessing. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their faces unshaven, their exhaustion obvious. But beneath the fatigue, she saw something she hadn't seen the first day. Humility, focus, intent. Maybe even respect. She stepped in front of them. 3 days ago, she began softly, you made a choice, a bad one. You judged someone based on what you thought you saw, and you acted from ego, not discipline. No one spoke, no one moved. But these last 72 hours, her voice slowed, turning reflective. You've shown me something I didn't expect. You showed me you're capable of learning, of hurting, of changing, and that matters more than your mistakes. Jenkins stepped forward without being asked, not defiant now, not arrogant, just honest. Lieutenant Reeves, he said, voice steady but emotional. We were wrong, and we know it. All we ask is a chance to prove it, to prove we can be what this place needs." Sarah studied his face, the bruise on his cheek, the exhaustion in his eyes, the new steadiness in his posture. Not perfect, but growing. She turned to Collins, who watched silently. "Colonel," Sarah said, "with your permission, I want to build a unit out of them." Collins looked at the cadets, then at Sarah. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded. "They need redemption, but maybe I do too." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Collins noticed, didn't comment, simply nodded. "Approved." Relief washed through the formation like a silent wave. Some cadets closed their eyes. Others clenched their fists. Jenkins inhaled shakily, holding himself together. Sarah stepped back, letting the weight of her next words settle. "Effective immediately, you are the redemption unit," she said. "Your first mission starts now. 15 minutes, full gear, wilderness deployment." Chaos erupted, controlled chaos. Cadets sprinted to prepare, fueled by adrenaline and second chances. Jenkins hesitated, approached her. "Lieutenant, can I ask one thing?" She crossed her arms. "Make it quick." "You could have told us who you were that first minute." His voice cracked slightly. "Why didn't you?" Sarah didn't hesitate this time. "Because I needed to see who you were before I showed you who I am," she said. "And more importantly, you needed to see it too." He nodded slowly, not understanding all of it yet, but enough. She watched him rejoin the others, her chest tightening again, but not from anger this time. Something softer, something she hadn't felt in years. A sense of purpose. A sense of beginning. Sometimes the hardest part of leadership wasn't giving orders. It was seeing what someone could be before they saw it themselves. Why did the forest feel more honest than any training hall? The moment Sarah stepped off the transport vehicle, the cold wilderness air wrapped around her like an old truth she couldn't escape. Wind rustled through the tall pines, carrying scents of earth, rain-soaked leaves, and quiet. Real quiet. The kind of quiet that once saved her life. The kind she leaned on more than people. Behind her, the redemption unit stumbled out, still stiff, still sore, still unsure. They weren't ready. Not for this terrain, not for her methods, maybe not even for themselves. But readiness wasn't what she wanted. She wanted honesty. Wilderness stripped lies fast. "Why here?" one cadet whispered under his breath. Sarah answered without turning. "Because the forest has no patience for ego." They fell silent. Their mission was simple on paper. Survive 48 hours using everything they had learned. But survival wasn't what she was testing. It was something deeper, something she'd learned the hardest way possible overseas. People didn't fail because they lacked strength. They failed because they didn't know themselves. She led them along a narrow path, her footsteps silent. The cadets tried to mimic her, but their breathing was too loud, their boots too heavy, their minds too distracted. Sarah didn't criticize. Not yet. This wasn't the time for words. Not until the forest had spoken first. The unit reached a clearing. Mist curled low against the ground, moving like memory. Sarah stopped and finally faced them. "For the next 48 hours," she said softly, "the only things that matter are your judgment, your patience, and your ability to stay human under pressure." Jenkins shifted his pack. He looked nervous but determined. "Lieutenant, what's the objective?" "Staying together," Sarah answered. "That's your objective." The cadets exchanged glances, confusion flickering through the group. Staying together sounded too simple, too easy, but nothing about this forest felt easy. Sarah stepped close enough for them to feel the weight behind her words. In combat zones, the most dangerous enemy is often the one inside your head. Out here, you'll hear things you don't want to hear about yourself, about each other. Don't run from that. She started walking again, and the cadets followed. Hours passed, the forest thickened, paths disappeared, their breathing quickened, packs grew heavier. One cadet fell behind, dragging his feet. Another became irritated with the slow pace. Another muttered under his breath about unfair expectations. Sarah saw every crack forming like tiny fissures running through a dam. She remembered this phase from her SEAL training, the mental unraveling, the way exhaustion stripped people down to their rawest selves. This was when truth began. By late afternoon, storm clouds gathered above them. The air shifted from cold to biting, the way it often did before rain. Sarah stopped at a ridge and surveyed the valley below, a stretch of darkening green, trees swaying as if warning them. "We set up camp here," she announced. The cadets groaned quietly. Even Jenkins looked relieved. They dropped their packs, wiped sweat from their brows, and began unpacking gear, clumsy, scattered, unfocused. Sarah crouched beside a fallen tree and observed. Within minutes she saw every flaw she expected: poorly tied knots, tents pitched on uneven ground, cadets arguing over placements. But she didn't intervene. Not yet. She walked to the edge of the ridge and watched the horizon grow darker. Thunder murmured in the distance. She felt a strange tug in her chest, familiar, unwelcome. Her last field mission overseas had ended in a storm too. A storm that hadn't taken her, but had taken someone she still carried in silence. She shook the memory off as Jenkins approached. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "they're trying, but we're not good at this yet." She turned to him. "And what about you?" He hesitated. "I'm trying too." Sarah studied him. Something in his voice was unguarded, raw, uncertain, honest. She nodded for him to continue. "I didn't realize how much ego I had," he admitted. "These last days, I saw things in myself I didn't like." Sarah inhaled slowly. Seeing the flaw is the first step, fixing it is the second, the hardest one. He swallowed. "Were you ever like us, unfocused, reckless, blind to your own problems?" The question surprised her, not the words but the sincerity behind them. "Yes," she said, "once." Jenkins blinked, taken aback. "But you're you." "I wasn't born this way," she replied. "Pain made me, fear shaped me, and loss taught me discipline." He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The answer settled between them, heavy, respectful, real. Before Sarah could say more, thunder cracked overhead. The forest darkened instantly, leaves shivering as the wind swept through the ridge. Rain began to fall. Hard, cold, relentless. The cadets scrambled, shouting directions, trying to secure their gear, trying not to panic as tents collapsed. Ropes loosened, and water poured through seams they thought were tight. Sarah moved calmly, purposefully. "Secure the perimeter," she ordered. "Off the ridge, move." The chaos had become a test the wilderness itself created. Cadets slipped on mud, packs soaked through, hands trembled. But something interesting happened. No one broke formation. No one abandoned the others. They shouted warnings, grabbed arms before falls, shared gear instinctively. Sarah's chest tightened, but this time with something warm. They were learning. But the storm sharpened, wind whipping branches, lightning carving the sky open. Sarah scanned the area, calculating. She knew the ridge was dangerous, lightning preferred height. They had to move fast. "Everyone down the slope," she yelled over the storm. "Now." Jenkins led the way, surprising her with his steadiness. The others followed, slipping and scrambling but moving together. A flash of lightning struck a tree near the clearing they had just left. The explosion of sound rolled through the forest like a physical force. Cadets flinched. One fell. Another screamed for help. Sarah climbed back up without hesitation. Her mind didn't think of danger, only responsibility. She reached the fallen cadet, grabbed his pack and pulled him upright. "You're okay," she said firmly, louder than the storm. "Move now." They descended the slope together, just as another lightning strike split a nearby boulder. When they finally reached the base of the hill, soaked, trembling, and covered in mud, Sarah scanned each face. No one was missing, no one injured, no one broken. She exhaled. Relief felt strange, unfamiliar, almost fragile. Jenkins approached her cautiously. Rain poured off his helmet. "Lieutenant, we stayed together." "Yes," she said quietly, "you did. And we listened." She looked at them, really looked. "Yes," she repeated, "you did." Jenkins hesitated. "Does that mean we passed?" She shook her head slowly. "Passing isn't a moment. It's a decision you make again and again. And right now," she surveyed the trembling, soaked, exhausted faces, "you're finally starting to make the right decisions." The cadets held each other's gazes. No arrogance, no resentment, just a shared understanding that hadn't existed before. Sarah felt the forest settle around them. Storm dying, wind softening, silence returning. But inside her, the real storm was still there. The one she carried from deployment, the one she never spoke about, the one that made her part instructor, part survivor. She looked at her unit and wondered if they sensed it, the heaviness behind her calm, the history behind her skill, the grief behind her leadership. Maybe one day she would tell them. But not yet. For now, the forest had given them a truth she couldn't teach in any classroom. A team isn't forged by ease. It's forged by surviving the same storm. Why did the morning feel heavier than the storm they survived? The forest was calm now, washed clean by rain, sunlight filtering through branches like fragile gold. But the redemption unit wasn't calm. They sat in a rough circle around a small fire Sarah built with practiced ease, each cadet wrapped in blankets, steam rising from their soaked clothes. 4 hours of sleep, barely enough to function, but enough to learn. Sarah watched them quietly from the edge of the clearing. Their faces were different today. Less pride, more awareness. Something new, something almost sacred, the beginning of trust. "Lieutenant," Jenkins said softly, breaking the silence, "what's next?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She let the question settle, let the fire crackle, let their breathing sink in the quiet. She knew they expected another physical challenge, a test of endurance, strength, or skill. But the next step wasn't about muscle. It was about truth. She stepped closer to the fire. "Next," she said, "you learn something most soldiers never do until it's too late." They looked up, tired but attentive. "You learn what you carry." Confusion flickered across their faces. Sarah crouched, picking up a stone, smooth, cold, weighed down by rain. She held it up for all of them to see. "This," she said, "is what each of you will carry for the rest of the day." A cadet frowned. "Ma'am, with respect, it's just a rock." "Not just a rock," she corrected gently. "It's the thing you hate admitting, the thing inside you that gets in your way." Jenkins swallowed, understanding dawning slower, heavier. "You mean our flaw?" Sarah nodded. "Name it, hold it, carry it, feel its weight." Silence fell like another storm. This was the kind of silence that tested people more deeply than running or shooting or surviving the rain. One by one, they approached the basket of stones she placed near the fire. Each cadet hesitated before choosing one, as though the stone demanded honesty. The first cadet whispered, "Fear," and tucked the stone into his pocket. Another said, "Anger." "Impatience." "Doubt." "Arrogance." Jenkins stood last. He stared into the basket for a long time before selecting the heaviest stone. His jaw tightened. "Shame," he said. The word seemed to echo through the trees, and somehow it felt like the bravest thing anyone had spoken yet. Sarah nodded once, respectfully, gratefully. "Now," she said, "we walk." They spent the morning trekking through uneven trails and thick brush, the forest still dripping from the storm. Sarah led them deeper into the wilderness, away from visible paths, forcing them to rely on instinct and each other. The stones weighed on them, awkward in their pockets, uncomfortable against their hips. But Sarah watched carefully, noticing how each cadet unconsciously reached for the stone when the terrain became difficult. Not because of pain, because the weight reminded them of themselves. Halfway through the hike, a cadet tripped over a root and rolled down a small slope, hitting the ground with a grunt. Sarah rushed forward, but Jenkins reached him first, offering a hand without hesitation. "You good?" Jenkins asked. The cadet nodded but didn't stand. Instead, he pressed a hand over his stone, breathing shakily. "It's heavy," he muttered. Jenkins sat next to him, so is fixing what put it there. The cadet laughed weakly. "How'd you figure that out?" Jenkins looked up the trail where Sarah waited, arms folded, face unreadable. "Because she's teaching us the way no one taught me before." Sarah heard him, and though her face didn't change, something inside her softened, a feeling she rarely let herself acknowledge. Pride. Not for their strength, for their vulnerability. By noon, the sun burned through the clouds, warming the forest floor. Sarah led them to a creek, water rushing fast over smooth stones, clear enough to reflect their faces back at them. "Break," she announced. The cadets collapsed onto rocks and fallen logs, drinking water and catching their breath. Sarah remained standing, watching the water move, her expression shifting with thoughts she didn't share. One cadet approached uncertainly. "Lieutenant, can I ask something?" She nodded. "You carry something too, don't you?" Sarah's heart tightened. The question struck deeper than intended, like someone had reached into a place she kept locked. She searched the cadet's face. There was no disrespect, no curiosity for the sake of gossip, just human wondering. "Yes," she said quietly. "What is it?" She considered lying. She considered deflecting. But the forest, the moment, the honesty she demanded from them, it all pressed on her chest. She sat down on a rock, the creek's water brushing the tips of her boots. "I carry loss," she whispered, "every day." The cadets grew silent. Even Jenkins turned toward her. She picked up a small pebble from the creek, smooth and faded from time. "A teammate didn't make it back from my last deployment. I replay that mission in my head more than I like to admit." Her voice caught just slightly, more than she wanted them to hear. "I trained these exercises to prevent others from carrying the same weight," she continued softly. "But the truth is, some stones never leave your pocket." The cadets watched her with a seriousness that hadn't existed before. Something shifted in their posture, not pity, not discomfort, but reverence. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, why tell us that now?" "Because you're ready to hear it," she answered. "And because leaders need to know two things, their limits and their ghosts." They continued onward, moving through forest shadows that stretched long and thin across the ground. By late afternoon, the sky dimmed under thick gray clouds again. Not another storm, just the quiet heaviness that comes before dusk. Sarah led them to a clearing surrounded by tall, silent trees. A wide stump sat at the center like an altar. She motioned for the cadets to gather around. "This," she said, "is where you put your stone down." One by one, they approached the stump. Some placed their stones gently, others dropped them like confession. Each gesture carried emotion Sarah could feel through the air. Fear loosening its hold. Anger unwinding its grip. Shame softening around the edges. Doubt cracking open to let light in. When Jenkins stepped forward, he placed his stone slowly, almost delicately. "Thank you," he whispered, not to the stone, to her. Sarah hesitated when her turn came. She held the small pebble she picked from the creek, rolling it between her fingers. She stepped forward. But she didn't set it down. The cadets noticed. "Lieutenant, why keep it?" one asked gently. Sarah exhaled, her eyes glancing toward a distant memory only she could see. "Because some weights remind you why you lead," she said softly. "Not to escape the past, but to honor it." They didn't question her again. As evening settled, the unit built a camp together, efficiently, quietly, with cohesion that didn't exist even that morning. Sarah moved among them, correcting posture, adjusting ropes, offering guidance without raising her voice. The wilderness had stripped them of ego. Now she was rebuilding them with purpose. When the fire crackled to life and night took the forest, Sarah watched her cadets laugh softly, share stories, pass food. They were still flawed, still learning, still fragile. But they were becoming something she didn't expect when the mission began. A team. A family almost. And when she stepped back into the shadows of the trees, letting the flames flicker against the edges of her thoughts, she allowed herself a moment of quiet truth. Maybe redemption wasn't only for them. Maybe part of her needed it too. Sometimes the heaviest weight a soldier carries is the one they don't place on the stump. Why did the night feel different this time? The forest was dark, silent, and endless, but there was no fear in the redemption unit's posture, only alertness, focus. The firelight carved warm shadows across their faces as they sat close together, wrapped in blankets, sharing quiet conversations that carried a new kind of weight. Sarah watched them from a distance, half concealed among the trees. She preferred distance, silence, the space where her thoughts wandered freely and the past felt easier to manage. But tonight, something tugged at her, an instinct, a question, a feeling she couldn't yet name. Maybe it was because the cadets were evolving faster than she anticipated. Maybe because she saw pieces of herself in them, the old self, the broken one, the reckless one, the one who didn't know she was drowning until it was too late. Or maybe because, after years of shutting out connection, she could feel something opening again. "Lieutenant," Jenkins called gently from behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She waited until he stepped beside her, looking out at the campsite with a mixture of pride and hesitation. "They're different," he said quietly. "A few days with you, it changed something." Sarah didn't answer. She wasn't sure how to. Change was never clean, never simple, and never guaranteed. Jenkins rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, when we first met you, I was an idiot." "That's accurate," Sarah said flatly. He huffed a laugh, soft, embarrassed. "Yeah, I thought being loud meant being strong." "It doesn't," she replied. "It just means you're trying to convince yourself." Jenkins shifted his weight, the truth landing harder than he expected. "Lieutenant, can I ask you something personal?" "Depends," she replied. "You lost someone overseas," he said softly. "Does training us help with that?" Sarah stiffened. She didn't expect him to voice the question out loud. She wasn't even sure she had an answer. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes teaching feels like rebuilding something I lost, and sometimes it feels like I'm trying to prevent history from repeating." Jenkins nodded slowly. "You ever think you'll stop carrying it?" "No," she whispered. "But grief changes shape. It becomes quieter, heavier in different ways. You learn to walk with it instead of against it." He didn't respond, not with words. He just stood beside her, the silence between them less awkward now, more human, more earned. Eventually she spoke again. "Get some rest, Jenkins. Tomorrow's the final evaluation." He nodded and returned to camp, shoulders straighter than they'd been on the first day she met him. Watching him walk away, Sarah felt the faintest ache in her chest, a warmth she didn't trust yet. But she didn't turn away. She watched her unit sleep, one by one, their breathing steady and unguarded. She watched the fire crackle until it burned low. She watched the stars shift overhead, blinking like distant warnings or distant blessings. She couldn't decide which. Dawn arrived without warning, sharp, cold, and blue. The forest breathed out mist that curled around their ankles as the redemption unit stood at attention, visibly nervous but ready. Sarah stepped in front of them. "This is your final exercise," she said. "A simulation, but one that matters." They waited. Sarah pointed toward the thickest part of the forest, where the shadows clung low like fog. "Somewhere out there is a beacon. Your job is to find it together, without splitting up." One cadet raised a hand. "Permission to ask why splitting up is forbidden, ma'am." Sarah met his eyes. Because the last time a unit split under my command, someone didn't come back. Silence dropped over them like winter. They didn't ask again. Move, Sarah ordered. The cadets plunged into the forest. The terrain quickly turned into a maze, dense brush, fallen logs, sharp inclines. The forest looked peaceful from afar, but up close it was ruthless, branches clawing at sleeves, mud pulling at boots, shadows distorting their sense of direction. At first they stuck together easily, but an hour in fatigue returned, doubt slithered in. The same cracks Sarah had predicted began to form. I think we should head south. No, the map says we go east. Wait, did we pass this tree before? Arguments rose, frustration sharpened, old insecurities pushed against the fragile unity they'd built. Sarah followed from a distance unseen, listening to every word, watching every failure. She didn't intervene. Not yet. This was their moment to break again or to rise. The tension reached a tipping point when the cadets reached a steep ravine. Water rushed below, loud and unforgiving. A narrow fallen tree served as the only crossing. Fear rippled through the group. We'll never get across, one muttered. Jenkins turned. We will, one at a time, slow and steady. But another cadet snapped. We're wasting time. What if the beacon nowhere near this place? And a third said, maybe we should split. No, Jenkins' voice cut like steel. We stay together. The cadet arguing with him stood firm. Why? Because the lieutenant said so. No, Jenkins said quietly. Because I know what splitting up does to a team. The argument froze. Jenkins looked down at the ravine, jaw tight. I split once. I left someone behind. I was stupid. And I nearly lost one of my closest friends. His voice shook, barely noticeable. I'm not repeating that mistake here. Sarah watched, hidden among branches, her chest tightening with something she didn't expect. Respect. The cadets looked at one another, the truth in his voice settling their panic like a steadying hand. One by one, they nodded. Jenkins went first across the log, slow, careful, breathing controlled. Then he coached the others through it. Even the most terrified cadet crossed without falling. Sarah exhaled softly. This was the moment she had hoped for. Unity born from honesty. Leadership born from failure. Strength born from vulnerability. They found the beacon at dusk, tucked beneath a rocky overhang glowing faint blue against the shadows. When they approached it, panting and mud-covered, something about their posture told Sarah everything she needed to know. They found it together. She stepped out from behind the rocks. They stared at her, not with fear, not with guilt, not with resentment. With pride. You succeeded, she said. A slow smile crept across Jenkins' face. We stayed together. Yes, Sarah whispered, you did. Lieutenant, one cadet asked, voice trembling with emotion, does this mean we're ready? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She looked at them one by one, their bruises, their mud-streaked faces, their trembling muscles, their tired eyes. But more importantly, their unity, their humility, their growth. You're ready for the next step, she said softly. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply breathed deeply, collectively, the way soldiers breathe when they finally understand themselves. As they walked back through the forest, Sarah fell behind, letting the cadets lead the way. She felt something shift inside her, not healing, not closure, but something close. A thought. Maybe this unit wasn't just her assignment. Maybe they were her reminder. That even in a world built on conflict, people could still learn to choose each other. Why did the air on graduation morning feel sharper, as if the world itself was holding its breath? Fog drifted across the training compound, rising in thin ribbons that curled around boots and equipment crates. The redemption unit stood in formation, uniforms pressed, shoulders squared, faces carved with quiet resolve. Not the cadets she met days ago, not the boys who laughed when she walked into their barracks. These faces were different now. Stronger, quieter, older in ways only hardship could shape. Sarah Reeves stood before them, watching with a complicated ache in her chest. Pride mingled with something heavier, a familiar fear she hadn't felt in years. The same fear she felt whenever someone she cared about stepped into danger. She swallowed it. Soldiers didn't get to keep warm fears. They learned to bury them like old letters they never opened again. Colonel Collins approached, hands clasped behind her back, expression unreadable as she surveyed the unit. "Lieutenant Reeves," she said quietly, "they've exceeded expectations, all of them." Sarah nodded but didn't look away from her cadets. "They did the work," she replied. "I just gave them the mirror." Collins studied her a moment. "You know, I've seen instructors build discipline, skills, physical strength, but I've never seen someone rebuild character the way you did." "People aren't projects," Sarah said softly. "They're choices waiting to be made." Before Collins could respond, a voice behind her called out, "Lieutenant Reeves, ma'am." Jenkins, standing at the front of formation, eyes bright, posture steady but somehow human now, not stiff like before, not performative, simply grounded. Sarah stepped toward the unit. A hush fell over the field. "This evaluation was only the beginning," she said. "Redemption isn't something you earn once. It's something you live every day. And now you have a mission ahead of you, a real one." The cadets knew this. They had been notified the night before. They were deploying to the Eastern Conflict Zone on a humanitarian support operation. Not the most dangerous assignment, but dangerous enough to change anyone. "You'll work with locals," Sarah continued. "Protect aid routes, escort civilians, gather intel, and stabilize unstable sectors. You'll be tested in ways I can't simulate." Her voice dropped. "And you won't have me guiding your every step." A flicker crossed the cadets' faces, fear, but also determination. The kind that grows from surviving storms and finding each other in darkness. Jenkins cleared his throat. "Ma'am, will you be deployed with us?" Sarah hesitated. That hesitation alone made the cadet's expression shift. "Lieutenant," he asked again. She exhaled slowly. "Yes," she said, "I'll be leading your team." Relief washed through the formation like warmth after a long winter. But for Sarah, the words held a different weight, a silent promise she wasn't sure she deserved to make. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of combat. She was afraid of losing someone again. Preparation for deployment moved fast. Gear inspections, mission briefings, last-minute logistics. Jenkins approached her during weapons inspection, hesitating before speaking. "Lieutenant, what if we're not ready?" Sarah checked his rifle, handed it back, and met his eyes. "Being ready doesn't mean having no fear. It means having fear and moving anyway." He nodded, but doubt lingered in his expression. Sarah lowered her voice. "You're not the same man who cornered me in that barracks. You're not even the same man you were 3 days ago." Jenkins swallowed hard. "What changed me?" "You did," she said, "when you decided to become someone better." He didn't reply, but something softened in his posture like a knot loosening. 3 days later, the unit boarded their transport aircraft under a heavy gray sky. Wind whipped across the runway, tugging at sleeves and gear straps. Sarah stood at the foot of the ramp, watching each cadet climb inside. Something pulled at her chest again, an instinct honed from too many farewells. Collins approached her, her face unusually gentle. "You built something rare here," she said quietly. "Don't lose yourself trying to protect it." Sarah tightened her grip on her pack. "I won't." But she wasn't entirely sure. As she stepped into the aircraft, the engines roared awake and the world trembled beneath her boots. The ramp closed. Darkness swallowed them. The hum of flight filled the silence. And then Jenkins spoke. "Lieutenant, thank you." She didn't turn, she didn't need to. "You earned this," she said softly. "No," he replied. "You made us believe we could." She closed her eyes at the edge of the cargo bay, letting the vibration of flight settle into her bones. Maybe this wasn't just redemption for them. Maybe this was hers too. The Eastern Conflict Zone was colder than expected. Gray skies, empty streets, buildings scarred by old explosions, children watching from behind cracked doorframes with the kind of eyes that always stayed with you. The redemption unit moved like a real team now, tight formation, steady breathing, silent communication. Sarah watched them from the front, pride rising quietly in her chest. Midway through their patrol, they reached a small village where aid trucks had struggled to pass for weeks. The locals approached cautiously. Fear always lived close to hunger. But when Jenkins knelt to speak to a little boy clutching a torn blanket, the tension eased. Sarah felt her pulse slow. Her unit was doing exactly what they came here to do: protect, support, heal. Then she heard it. A distant echo. Metal scraping, boots shifting, a sound she could never forget, the sound that preceded ambushes. "Down," she ordered sharply. The cadets reacted instantly, taking cover, moving civilians behind walls. Sarah scanned rooftops, alleys, windows, her mind calculating, instinct rising, breath sharpening. A glint. Rifle barrel. 2 rooftops down. She didn't think. Training moved her faster than fear. One shot from her weapon cracked through the air, echoing off stone. The threat dropped. But there was a second glint, different angle, aimed not at her. At Jenkins. Sarah swallowed panic and fired again, precise, decisive. Silence fell. Smoke thinned. The village exhaled. And Sarah realized something. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear of being shot. From fear of losing them. Jenkins jogged to her side, breath ragged. "Lieutenant, what just?" "You're fine," she said, forcing her voice steady. "Stay alert." But he wasn't stupid. He saw something different in her eyes, the same way she sometimes saw ghosts in her own. "Ma'am," he whispered, "you saved my life." Sarah looked away. "That's my job." "No," he said gently, "that was more than duty." She didn't respond, couldn't. The weight in her chest pressed too hard. The unit regrouped, secured the area, assisted civilians. But something had shifted in the air, in her mind, in the fragile space where fear and love lived too close together. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised colors, Sarah finally allowed herself to breathe. Her unit was safe. Alive. Stronger than the day she met them. And when Jenkins approached again, quietly asking, "Lieutenant, what now?" she finally had an answer. "Now," she said, "you lead." He blinked at me. "You're ready." He took a slow breath, emotion rising but steadying. "And you?" Sarah looked out at the horizon, at the fading smoke, the last light of day, the silhouettes of people still standing because her unit stood with them. "I'll be right behind you," she whispered, "where leaders belong." He nodded, not as a cadet, not as the reckless boy she once disarmed, but as the man she helped forge. They joined the rest of the unit. Evening settled around them, tired, scarred, but hopeful. And Sarah felt something settle inside her too. Not peace. Not closure. Something simpler. A truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be seen. Sometimes dignity just acts. Quietly, steadily, and with enough courage to lift others into the light it never asked for.